Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Keffa Wush Wush wash processed Ethiopia from Grandmum Cafe. And there's the bag right there. And Grandmum, based out of Saigon, Vietnam. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Sidama Duancho, a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And as is usually the case when trying a roaster for the first time, I like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, with this one acting as the washed representative. And additionally, what caught my interest about this coffee was that it is a Wush Wush coffee. And I've had negative experiences with Wush Wush coffees in the past, so I've mostly been avoiding them. However, this felt like a good opportunity to revisit this varietal, as it is one that I originally thought was going to become a lot bigger than it ever became. And even now, it's not too common to see many Wush Wush coffees out there, so seeing one from a coffee roaster that we were already planning on reviewing felt like a really good opportunity to try out both. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 54. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. However, we also went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. My roast profile for this coffee, this one is definitely a fair bit lighter than the experience that we did have from the Sidama Duancho. And I just noticed when recording that Sidama Duancho review that they do have listed on the back here that they recommend 25 days worth of rest for their coffees. And I can see why, given the lightness of this one. Now, once again, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's anywhere near the lightness of the other Vietnamese-based coffee roaster that we reviewed on this channel, which is, of course, XLIII 43. But even then, this one did turn out a little bit lighter than I probably would have expected given our experience with the other coffee that they do have. So I can say that this one probably skews on the slightly more moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 29, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was a little bit lighter than expected. And it's kind of tricky because I really didn't know what to expect from this coffee roaster going into it. And I always say that's the case, especially when it comes to Asian coffee roasters that you don't have a lot of familiarity with. You can just kind of go based off of the information that somebody provides to you. And in this case, it's usually Airworks and what they say about these coffees. But even then, given that the feedback we had heard was that it's a little bit more developed overall, and I feel like the majority of the coffees they released were a little bit more developed overall, having this one be the lightest of those coffees probably did seem to help our overall experience, especially on this first try, as it was actually a little bit grainy too, which in some ways does help a coffee like this, given that it does show that it probably will be improving with time. There was an overall lack of sweetness though, which has been a theme to the Wush Wush coffees we've had in the past, and that's been the big sticking point to me on Wush Wush coffees, is that they just lacked sweetness overall. And this coffee was marketed as supposedly being on the sweeter side of things, but this first impression didn't lend itself towards that experience, as there's a slight bit of honey in the finish, but for the most part, it was extremely tame. So just an okay first impression. Day 32 through the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar sentiment this time around, as it was just lacking in terms of everything. And I found the coffee to be extremely strange on the second try, as there was little intensity, sweetness, or even brightness. There was just a very generic, light coffee experience to it. As it cooled down, there was more of the listed honey-like aspects to it in a relatively long-lasting sense, which will play a role in this review, but outside of that, still very, very tame overall. Day 35 through the UFO Brewer, and there's been consistency to this one, as it just feels like it's lacking any defining characteristic whatsoever. At this moment, I could say that there was a quality reminiscent of a cracker, and given that it's a grainy and a cracker feel, it has that lightness to it in that sense, with a faint honey in the finish. Another just okay day when it came to this coffee, but once again, it did show potential in the sense that it was probably maybe just a little bit lighter. I didn't want to assume that it was the varietal, but I'll be completely honest, I assumed it was the varietal. I just assumed that I really did not like Wush Wush coffees. Day 38 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so we pushed it, higher temperatures, lower concentration, and a more fine grind, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, largely due to the increased intensity that it did offer, with plenty of a intense tea-like quality to go with a honeyed sweetness and significantly less of those cracker qualities. In the grand scheme of things, it was still relatively tame, but for what we'd experienced of this coffee, it was significantly more intense, which definitely did seem to help. Day 41 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was the best that had been to this point by a distance, as it's starting to offer a better level of intensity to it, especially in the honeyed sense. Cracker qualities were almost non-existent, with slightly more sweetness and a more pronounced citric quality to it as well. So all of that seemed to help, given that there was just a lack of definition at the start with a very slight honey finish. This one having more of that honey quality to it and just more depth in general definitely did seem to help. And on day 44, final notes we have through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was the best that had been to this point. I should say that I don't know if it was necessarily the brew method that we opted to go for with this coffee that did seem to help. I honestly think that in hindsight, looking back on it, it was probably giving this coffee more time, as here on this day 54 mark, it is the best it's been to this point, largely because it has improved in terms of the overall intensity to it. It does have a very deep sweetness to it, as it's mostly honey forward, to the point where it's reminiscent of what I would describe as some of the more super honey forward Rwandan coffees that we've reviewed this year. We've actually had a number of those. Outside of that, the coffee does feel extremely tame off brew, and from that point going forward, it has a strangely long-lasting finish to it, which does come in a sweeter sense, a slightly caramelized, candied feel in that regard as well. Traces of stone fruit, but primarily a slightly bitter citrus that's in line with the listed grapefruit quality, and very subtle traces of berries as well. So much more depth, significantly better. I'm happy that this coffee turned out significantly better than what we had at the start. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, and that is the finish level 5. I have to say, it's one of the more strange experiences that I've had for a coffee, because I can't quite recall the last time we had a coffee that finished at a level 5, but the sweetness was at a level 3. But this one, for whatever reason, just seemed to have that very lingering, long-lasting honeyed and citric feel to them, neither of which were particularly sweet. So make of that what you will. The finish was just very extended to the point where it was more than justified there at the level 5 mark, especially for a wash processed coffee, especially one that came out so tame right from the start. All right, let's move on to level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Certainly nothing to take away from the cleanliness. If we were being very, what's the word I'm looking for? Judgmental or harsh? Yeah, if we're being very harsh on the earlier days, you could say that maybe the overly grainy or overly cracker-like feel to this coffee could have hindered it. But even then, it would have been way too harsh to score at anything lower than the level 4. Better definition with time, even if early on it wasn't the most intense coffee. So level 4, ideal place for this one. Florality level 4. I think that the have honey note as one of the qualities listed on here. I know it's honey, grapefruit, and what else? Jasmine. Oh yeah, the jasmine does make a lot of sense, especially in terms of the florality. Not something that I mentioned too much, largely because I think it was dominated by the honey characteristics of this coffee. Regardless, plenty of florality to it, as it did present in an Ethiopian-like sense, even if it was a very tame Ethiopian-like sense at times. Citrus fruit level 4, mentioned a little bit more of a bitter citric quality to it, and usually when I see grapefruit on a coffee, I have optimism because I actually like the way that grapefruit translates in coffee itself. It usually comes out a little bit more peachy for me, but not the case with this coffee, a little bit more bitter, so a little bit more along the lines of those grapefruit characteristics. Level 4, where we opted to put it nonetheless. I'm fine with that, actually, because on the earlier days, I could say it was such a generic, lacking citric quality that we were probably bumping it down to a level 3 because it didn't particularly have much intensity to it. All right, let's go to those level 3s. So we will start with the sweetness level 3. It's a weird sweetness. I really don't know how to describe the sweetness other than it being very deep, because it's not overly intense or pronounced, but it's there, and it comes in that slightly more candied caramelized sense. I can't quite recall when we have had a coffee that's had a level 3 in terms of caramel, but the sweetness scoring a level 3 as well, and the finish scoring level 5. This is a 1 of 1 tasting. Well, I can guarantee we have never had another coffee that's scored these specific marks for this coffee. Acidity level 3. On the earlier days, you know what's really interesting about this coffee is I would have scored the sweetness and the acidity at a level 2, verging closer on the level 1 than actually on the level 3. That's just how much this coffee was lacking on those earlier days. So make of that what you will, both of which are at that level 3 mark. I would say the sweetness is a little higher than the acidity on this one, but neither of which were overly intense in this one. Stone fruit level 3. I did get those traces of peach, which I'm very happy with. I feel like that added some depth to this coffee, and I just wish it was maybe a little bit more intense and sweet, and that probably would have helped my experience even more so. And then 2 things left worth discussing. The caramel level 3. That's more of that deep sweetness. I've discussed it a fair bit within this coffee, and I really don't know what to make of that. It's there, but it's kind of at a very even level 3, which doesn't seem to push the sweetness any higher than it does. And the final thing we're discussing, body level 2, probably a big component of the brew method that we opted for, the profile of this coffee. I mean, everything in theory would lend itself towards this coffee scoring lower in terms of the body, and it certainly did, a little bit more tea-like, but still enough body and texture to push it above that true level 1 mark. So outside of that, yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's an interesting tasting wheel, but a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, definitely enjoyed it more than the Sidama du Wancho. I found it to be an interesting coffee, and it's kind of an important coffee in the sense that it does make for more interesting whoosh whoosh reviews in the future. I still don't know too many coffee roasters that do offer them. I feel like I've seen some Colombian whoosh whooshes out there, but we go through and look at so many coffee roasters and coffees in our stream, and I rarely see whoosh whoosh coffees while going through those streams. And even outside of that, when I'm just looking at coffees in general, I don't see too many whoosh whoosh coffees. So it was better than the other whoosh whoosh coffee we've reviewed on this channel, which was a while ago. It was from Red Rooster, and I still very well remember that coffee for the same reason that I remember that coffee. It seemed to lack a lot of intensity, especially on some of the earlier days to it, but that one never seemed to improve, where this one did. And I'm still kind of curious to see what more we could have gotten out of this coffee were we not working with such a small bag. But even then, it's an interesting review. It opens the door for future whoosh whoosh reviews and more Grandmum reviews if we were to bring them back in the future. But that does lead into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. We'll start with the profile. Again, it's lighter than the majority of other Asian-based coffee roasters. I should say Japanese and Korean coffee roasters that we've reviewed on this channel. And it's just lighter profiled in general. So that's the first place I want to start. I don't want to use the word complex because I hate using that word when it comes to describing coffees, but it's interesting. It's deep. There's characteristics in this one that are found in a subtle sense, while this coffee doesn't always present in the most intense or loud sense whatsoever. It's clean, it's floral forward, and it offers plenty of citrus. So very much what you would expect of an Ethiopian coffee, if maybe presented in a slightly more subdued yet deep sense. That's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Keffa Wush Wush wash processed Ethiopia from Grandmum Cafe. Thank you for watching.